Okay, in this demo I'm going to talk about tearing paper and or cutting down paper to be the size that you want it for your projects. I've got a piece of Stonehenge paper here. It's one of the papers I recommended for screen printing. However, you can also use, I don't know, Reeves BFK, Arches 88, any sort of really like sturdy, good, like 90 to 200 pound, I'm gonna say 200 pound paper. So I'm just going to be using some Stonehenge here. Underneath I have a clean cutting mat. You don't need to use a cutting mat if you're tearing your paper. You can just use a regular table surface or whatever, but since I'm going to show you guys cutting with an X-Acto knife versus tearing your paper for deckled edges, I've got my cutting mat down here, and I'll also be using my cutting mat as a source of measurement since there are measurements on like all four sides of this thing, so that defeats like needing to use a ruler. So I'm going to use this as a way to measure out my paper. I have a couple of different tools over here. So I have a tear bar that I'm going to be using for this demo to tear down my paper. A lot of you guys probably don't have one of these at home, and they are pretty pricey. So you don't necessarily need to use a tear bar to tear down your paper. You can use like the sharp edge of a ruler, but if you want a more professional and more secure kind of tear while you're ripping your paper, a tear bar is the best way to go. But yeah, we definitely have one in the lab that you guys can use, and if you do want to purchase one, like I said, they are kind of expensive, so you don't necessarily have to purchase one, but I like using them. So I also have a yard stick here, a yard ruler. I'm using one that's pretty long, like a yard long, because my paper is pretty big. So yeah, so you want to make sure that you guys get a ruler that is at least, I would say, 36 inches long, or at least 24. That way you have it so you can tear down your paper without having to slide your ruler down while you're tearing. And then over here I have an X-Acto knife that I'm going to be using for cutting my paper. I think the cutting of the paper is pretty self-explanatory, but I'm going to just have this here anyway, just to show you guys. And then I also have a pencil that I'm going to use to make some marks on my paper. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the back side of my paper and I'm going to line it up with the edge of my cutting mat here, with this line all the way at the left, and that line indicates 0. So if you're using a cutting mat to tear down your paper, please line it up at the line right here. It's not the 1. Don't line it up on the 1. Line it up on the edge of your mat here where this white line starts. I don't know. In previous semesters, lots of people for some reason got confused and were lining, I think, their paper up at the 1 mark. But if you know how rulers work, the 1 inch is like 1 inch in. So you want to start it before the 1 inch. So we're going to line it up all the way to the edge here. And I'm going to shoot this at a different angle so you guys can kind of see closer to what I'm doing down here. But for right now, I'm going to tear down my paper at this angle and sort of just get that out of the way. I'm tearing down from the back of my paper because it is traditional in printmaking for you guys to tear down your prints from the back. When you tear your paper, you'll notice that there's a lip that creates from where you've rested your tear bar down on the paper, and from where you pulled, it makes like a little lip. And you don't want that showing up on your final print. You want your final print to have a nice like flat, smooth surface on the front. So you want to make sure that if you're tearing down your prints before or after you've printed them, that you're tearing them down from the back to make sure that you're not getting that lip to show up in your final print. And I'll show you guys what I mean about that after I tear down my paper. So on most paper, there's a watermark And the watermark is a good indication of whether or not the paper is the front or the back. You can see if you have a paper with a watermark. Stonehenge usually doesn't have a watermark, which makes it a little bit more confusing. But you can see if you have a paper that has a watermark on it, if you can read the watermark forwards, then that's the front of the paper. In the back, the watermark will be in reverse. So make sure, like I said before, when you're tearing down your paper, that you're tearing down from the back, because ideally we want to make our prints on the front of our paper. With Stonehenge here, the way that you can tell is that, I think this is, yeah, the back side of the paper will be a little bit smoother than the front. With most printmaking papers, there's like a nice rough texture that you want in your paper, and usually that rough texture will be on the front of your paper because you want to have like that nice like grit, especially if you're working with other different processes, like perhaps maybe like litho or intaglio. You want that nice sizing to hold the ink in your paper. So Stonehenge, like I said, is a little bit tricky to determine, but the front side will be a little bit rougher than the back. So I think this is the smoother side. So I'm going to tear down from here. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure out my paper to be the size of my project, or a little bit larger. So for screen printing, what you guys are going to be doing is the hole punch registration. You can also use the blue tape registration as well by marking off the corners of your paper with blue tape. But for me tearing down my paper today, I'm going to leave extra room for my hole punches. That way when I go to pull my prints, I'm not like running my squeegee over my registration pins. My hole punch registration isn't getting in the way of my like acetate or anything else like that. So I'm going to be making my paper a little bit longer than what I want my final print size to be. So I have my little sketch here of my little birdie, and ultimately I decided that the paper size I'm going to tear down to is going to be 7 by 10. Here, I'll flip it around so you can see. So I'm going to make it 7 wide, and it's going to be 10 long. And then the final like actual size of this print will probably be more like around postcard size. So I might cut it off to about like a couple of inches, if not like an inch above his head here. So, but just to be on the safe side, I'm making my paper size 7 by 10. Like I said, this is going to depend on the size of your image that you're doing and what project that you're doing. So if you have a larger image, you're going to, of course, tear larger pieces of paper. If you have a smaller image, you can tear smaller pieces of paper. For what I'm doing, I've just sort of made some arbitrary calculation as to what size paper that I want for my project. So that's what I'm going to do. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the measurements that are at the bottom of my cutting mat here. If you don't have a cutting mat, like I said, you can just use a ruler. And again, line up your paper to the edge of your ruler, not at the one, at the edge of the ruler, and then you can mark off the measurements from there. So this is about 30 inches, and most of your papers that you'll buy will come in about 22 by 30 inches. Sometimes you can get them a little bit larger, but usually the standard printmaking paper size is about 22 by 30. So since this long side is 30 inches and one of my final measurements is 10, I'm just gonna go ahead and mark off 10, 20, and then 30. So I can get 3 sheets of 10 going this way. So I'm going to mark it off at the bottom here. And then I'm going to mark it off at the top. So I'm going to mark off 10, 20, and then 30 is the edge of my paper. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to keep my paper to the edge of my cutting mat here. And I'm going to tear with my tear bar. And I'm going to line up the edge of my bar on the 10 marks on my cutting mat here. On a tear bar, I'm going to show you guys real quick. You can see that there is a beveled edge, and then on the other side there's a blunt edge. You want to make sure if you're going to use a tear bar that you're using the beveled edge to tear your paper. The blunt edge will not tear easily. I mean, it's still, you can still tear with it, but it's going to be a pain. So you want to make sure that you're using the beveled edge because this is the sharper edge and what it's used for. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make sure that I'm always holding down the tear bar securely while I'm tearing my paper. If you're not secure with holding this guy down, it'll slide around and then you can get like mishaps in tearing your paper, or I don't know, catastrophe could happen. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're holding down the tear bar the whole entire time that you are tearing your paper. And what I always do is I always grab the excess edge of my paper and I always pull towards me. And I just go slowly, making sure that I move my hand to hold down that tear bar the whole time. And tear all the way down my paper. So, yeah, so if you can see here, there is a little lip at the edge of my paper here from where you can see where my bar was. And then on the reverse side, it's flat and you have that nice like deckled edge. So yeah, so you want to make sure that you are tearing your prints, like I said before, from the back. Okay, so I've already torn down all my paper, but if you can see here, this is the back of my paper. You can see that lip I was talking about when you tear down your paper. So you don't want this showing up in your final print. It just doesn't look right, it's not professional. But if we flip this guy over, it's nice and flat and there isn't a lip from where the tear bar was. So like I said, make sure that you're tearing your paper down from the back, especially when you're done printing. That way you don't get this nasty lip looking thing on the front of your prints. So let's say though that you don't have a tear bar and you're like, I'm not gonna spend $70 on a tear bar because that's ridiculous. That's fine too, you don't need one. What you can use is you can also use just like a ruler, a sharp edge of a ruler. Or like I said, you can cut your paper down with X-Acto knives. I personally prefer the deckled edge. That's what printmaking's all about, is that deckled edge. So I like to tear my paper. Plus, I think it's kind of fun to tear paper. But anyway, I digress. So I'm going to take my ruler, and again, I'm going to line it up to the 10 mark on both the top and bottom of my cutting mat. I also marked it off with pencil that way, just in case. And then just for, I don't know, consistency purposes, I lined up this edge of my paper all the way to the edge of my mat here. You don't have to do that, but it makes sense in my head to just keep like lining it up with that edge and then measuring out from there. So that's what I did. And the same thing with the ruler, I'm just going to hold it down. You want to make sure that your ruler is clean before you do this, otherwise you're going to get like dirt and stuff on your paper. But anyway, so you want to hold down the ruler with your less dominant hand, and then I always pull towards me with my right hand because I'm right-handed. And again, I'm just moving my hand down the ruler and holding it as I pull my paper and tear it. And then ta-da! It still kind of creates that same deckled edge. I don't know, it's not as nice, I guess, as the tear bar, but you really can't tell. So, I don't know, it's good enough for me. So there you go. So then I have my 3 sheets of 10 pieces of paper, or excuse me, of 10 inches. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to tear down 7 inches the shorter way. So I'll move these guys to the side here. And I'm going to, again, line up my deckled edge here to the edge of my cutting mat, and then I can mark out 7, but I'm just going to use the measurements on the cutting mat here. So if you're using an X-Acto knife, please do not use the tear bar for using the X-Acto knife to cut your paper. This blade plus that blade, it's going to dig into it and make the tear bar blade even duller. So don't do that. Just use a ruler to line up your X-Acto knife. But yeah, if you want to use an X-Acto knife to cut your paper, same thing, line up your ruler or a straight edge to where you want to cut your paper, and then just go over it with a sharp X-Acto knife. Yeah. And then you kind of get that sharp edge with your paper here. I don't know. Like I said, I'm not a big fan of the sharp edge. I like the deckled edge, so for the remainder of this demo, I'm just going to be using my ruler slash tear bar to create my deckled edges. And then with scrap pieces of paper, if they're really small like this, you can just recycle them. If they are larger scraps of paper, I'd say save them, and you can use them for like little test projects or smaller, I don't know, smaller prints that you might make in the future. Since you guys know that this printmaking paper is kind of pricey, it's important to save as much of it as you can and to reuse it. So yeah, but this guy is a little bit too small for anything that I would use, so I would just toss this in the recycling bin. Okay, so by the end of my paper tearing session, I have about, I don't know, a lot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 pieces of paper here that will be used for making my print. Another thing that I'll probably mention again in another video once we start getting into all the different processes, but it's important that with any sort of printmaking that you're doing, that you tear down or cut down more paper than the size of your final edition. So say that for your final project or whatever, the edition size is 5 and then you have 2 proofs, so like 7 prints total. I would honestly cut down about like, I don't know, maybe 15 sheets of paper just in case, because even though like if you're being careful and sure or whatever, there's mistakes that always happen when you're printing, like misregistration, ink globs, like I don't know, the possibilities are endless as to what could happen. So it's important that you tear down more paper than you actually need, and then again, like if you, I don't know, don't use that extra paper, you have it for another project. So always make sure that you guys tear down extra paper for your projects. That way, when you're going ahead and you're like labeling and signing your final edition, you can pick out the best prints from the ones that you printed, and then either use the rest as like practice prints or whatever, reuse them for another project. So yeah, so that's how you tear paper / cut paper and get it ready to go for registration.